This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat Extra. One way to understand labor history is to just look at some of the superstars as time goes by. For example, Moses. Moses, in the biblical days, freed slaves, didn't he? Slaves were labor at that time. Labor progressives, I believe, are the ones that were really outstanding in history, were the ones who tried to organize everybody, not just the convenient ones or not just certain ones. Spartacus was a great labor organizer. He tried also to free the slaves in the Roman Empire. Now, in the case of Moses and in the case of Spartacus, the bosses were not very happy with their efforts. And Moses may have succeeded. Spartacus didn't. He was executed, crucified, along with thousands of his followers. The point I'm trying to make is that they might have all succeeded, except for the fact that they had opponents. The people that were against them defeated them. They may or may not have made mistakes, and perhaps they could be criticized for their mistakes. But that isn't why they lost. They lost because the other side, the boss's side, beat them. And in Spartacus' case, of course, it was fatal. The most successful of all slave rebellions, and I'm not sure if I can pronounce Toussaint Louverture, but he led a successful slave rebellion in Haiti. The Haitians have been punished for it ever since, but nevertheless, in the earliest part of the 19th century, Toussaint Louverture led a successful slave rebellion. And I put him in my pantheon of labor's heroes, people who freed labor, people who organized labor. In the 19th century, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels organized the International Association of Workingmen. Now, I was talking about criticizing people. You could criticize them, I suppose, for having left working women out of their title. But the International Association of Workingmen was an effort to organize everybody in the world, and not just the people in England where they were. It didn't last long. It foundered. But the name International continued, and there became a second International, which is more or less still going on today. There was a third International at one time that was quite powerful and had the bosses pretty scared. Then there was a fourth International, a fifth International, maybe even a sixth International. I don't know if the fourth, fifth, and sixth are still in existence, but I know that they were called into existence at one time. As far as I know, the only one that's extant is the Second International, which still goes on. It's called the Social Democrats International. Here in America, we had a hero emerge right after the Civil War. As industrialization took over America, and the Civil War settled that, didn't it? The industrialists were going to run America after they defeated the agriculturalists in the South. And unions sprang up. One of these guys was an iron molder named William H. Silvis. William H. Silvis was so dedicated to organizing everybody that he's famous just for the first part of this quote. I love this union cause. Lots of union people know that much about William H. Silvis, that he's the one who said that. He worked so hard at it that it killed him. He got it started, I think, in 1869, and I think he died in 1870, and I think it disappeared right after that. The next effort to organize everybody was the Knights of Labor, and they had chapters everywhere, not just in America, too, around the world. They're the ones, more than anybody else, who organized the great 8-hour-a-day strike of May the 1st, 1886. And they had a great victory here in Texas. It started here in Texas. It started in Sherman, Texas, when the Knights of Labor had a convention, and they called a strike against the Great Southwest Railway. and won. Jay Gould was the railroad baron that they were striking against, and nobody thought they could beat him, but they did beat him in 1885. However, in 1886, he broke the contract, forced them on strike again, and then did what he was famous for bragging that he could do. Jay Gould, the railroad baron, Jay Gould, the railroad baron, used to brag, "I can hire half the working class to kill the other half." And he did hire gunmen right and left. There were shootouts here in Texas, and a lot of railroad men got killed, and they did lose in 1886. The guy who led the strike was buried in Bruceville, and if you're on Highway 35 as you go through Bruceville, you can see a historical marker by his tombstone. This leads us to Eugene Victor Debs, who may have been the greatest of all American trade unionists. He was a fireman on the railroad, and he was promoted, until he was running his own local. But then he noticed that the unions were all kind of scattered, and especially the railroad unions. There were like 10 or 12 different brotherhoods in the railroads. So he put together all of them into one, the American Railway Union. And the bosses were so threatened by it that they immediately forced him out on strike. They lost the strike. The government joined in on the strike, defeated the union, and put Eugene Victor Debs in jail. There's a quote from him. You can find hundreds of quotes from Eugene Victor Debs. He was a great orator and just a very quotable guy. Eugene Victor Debs also, in the earliest part of the 20th century, was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, often miscalled the International Workers of the World because they were internationalists, but their name was Industrial Workers of the World. And the reason for the name industrial was they were differentiating themselves from the AFL. The American Federation of Labor emphasized organizing only the elite, only the highest paid, only the most skilled workers, and that was called craft unionism. So the industrial workers of the world were dead set against that approach, and they wanted to organize everybody. So if you were in industry anywhere, they wanted to organize you. If you were pushing a broom, or the most skilled craftsman, or a woman typing notes for her boss, or whatever you did, they wanted you. And a lot of them traveled the country. It was a very, very romantic period when the industrial workers of the world were threatening the bosses in the United States, and the bosses were very scared of them. And they had some wonderful successes in textile in the Northeast, especially because they would organize women and they would organize immigrants, which the AFL basically just didn't. One of the greatest of all the organizers of the industrial workers of the world was named Frank Little. He grew up in Oklahoma and was killed, he was lynched in Butte, Montana in 1917. But the reason I included him, besides the fact that he's my favorite of all the most romantic organizers, the reason I included him is that I believe he wanted to organize everybody. He even wanted the industrial workers of the world to find a way to work with the American Federation of Labor. Now, that was not the IWW's program, and they really didn't want to do it. They hated the AFL, and the AFL hated them even more. But Frank Little was one of the ones who was hoping to find some way to change all union organizing into industrial organizing. It pretty much failed, not because of the errors that they made, although I'm sure they made some errors. They failed because the bosses defeated them. The other side beat them. And today we still have a few people of the industrial workers of the world, but they're not the threat that they were, say, in 1917 when Frank Little was killed. But the idea of working inside the AFL finally paid off in 1935. In 1935, the AFL was convinced to set up an industrial organizing committee. So they call it the Committee for Industrial Organizing. And they had some stirring, fantastic successes. They organized General Motors, and they were very, very good at this industrial organizing, and thousands of people were pouring in. The AFL, the old leadership, didn't really like that. They still wanted to divide everybody up by crafts. So the Committee for Industrial Organizing left the AFL, renamed themselves the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and then organized like crazy, including the Great Pecan Shellers Strike in San Antonio that you've probably heard about. That's what that picture is. But in 1947, things began to go the wrong way. The government found its footing and began to oppose the unions and make it very, very hard to organize. Union membership began to fall. It peaked, I think, around 1957 and fell to the point that we've lost more than 2/3 of our union density since then. So things looked pretty bleak by 1995 when a new leadership took over the AFL-CIO. The AFL and the CIO had been joined together back, I think, in 1955 or so, and but they still pretty much had the attitudes that the AFL had. They didn't want to organize immigrants, for example. They wanted to have them all deported. So the AFL-CIO had a new leadership in 1995, and they started changing things. They started organizing people that previously they would not organize, and that's why I'm putting them in my list of progressive labor leaders. In 1999, at their convention, they completely changed their position on immigrants and said very clearly, this business of trying to get them deported has never worked for us. It's worked for the bosses. It's never worked for us. And we're going to have to try organizing them. So from 1999 on, the AFL-CIO has basically tried to organize everybody. And it's a new day for labor, a wonderful day for labor. They've been trying to not only organize unions, but also become allies with the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and other progressives. So that since 1995, we've had a very progressive. This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat Extra.